Well, COVID-19 is but one in a long list of pandemics over many hundreds of years. Plagues and epidemics have been around since the dawn of civilization, in fact. And the Spanish flu of 1918 wiped out an estimated 50 million people across the globe. South Africa was not immune. Soldiers returning from World War I believed to have brought the Spanish flu home with them, and it's an estimated 300,000 South Africans who died at that time. Can we learn lessons from 100 years ago? Well, let's discuss this now by Howard Phillips, Emeritus Professor in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town. Good evening to you, Prof, and thank you so much for joining us. You have studied Spanish flu of 1918 in South Africa extensively. Is it the returning soldiers that brought it back with them?
Yeah, it's the last year of World War I. Soldiers were being moved widely around the world, and on those overcrowded troop ships, troop trains, that was ideal environment for a virus to spread very, very rapidly indeed. And
how did it spread so quickly across the country, and what proportion of our population did it kill?
Sally, the soldiers who returned were put in a very cursory quarantine, and then they were allowed to return home. And they embarked on trains from Cape Town, and the trains carried them to every corner of the country, and they took the flu epidemic with them. Ultimately, it's perhaps 5–6% of the total population who were killed in the space of 6 weeks. Contemporaries called it Black October. Short, sharp, very virulent indeed.
How absolutely horrific. And how did it die out? How was it wiped out?
Well, quite simply, it had infected so many people that those who survived had temporary immunity to it. And consequently, it really had a decreasing number of would-be vulnerable people who could contract it. And so in the absence of a minimum number of people to carry it forward, it more or less died out. It's rather like a bushfire, which spreads rapidly, which devastates, and then there's no more vegetation for it to feed on. And in this case, those people who survived had immunity, and so when a third wave came to South Africa in 1919, it was relatively light in its impact because so many people had acquired temporary immunity. I mean, rather paradoxically, probably making sure that you didn't succumb in the third wave was the likely consequence of having contracted it in the second wave.
Well, this is the other thing, is that this issue of waves of the virus. We know that viruses mutate, and if we move now to perhaps lessons that we can learn from 1918, is one of them be careful of the second or the third wave?
That is one of the most frightening prospects. At the moment, if we look at the figures such as they are, and I don't know how much reliance we can place on the figures for coronavirus, coronavirus is probably killing about 11 or 12% of the total number of people who, of 100 people who contracted in Italy. That's about the worst. So at worst at the moment, it's 11 in 100. In South Africa, it's a fraction of that. It's not even 1% yet. In the worst hit countries in 1918, we're talking about 25% of 100 who were killed by the virus. And that's because that virus mutated and changed, moving from one which was very infectious to one which was both infectious and deadly. That is what, at all costs, we should hope does not occur with the coronavirus.
Well, I look, over 100 years on, 2020, and we have amazing science and people who are working hard on a vaccine. We know so much more about how viruses are transmitted. We know how to test, and we know how to screen. We know about the importance of lockdowns. Surely we are better prepared for any pandemic, or not, if you think globalization and how people move around.
Well, of course, the speed in 1918 was the speed of the then latest technology, which was the steamship or the locomotive. Fast forward to 2020, the speed is of a jet aircraft. And of course it means that literally it can move from one continent to another overnight. That was not the case in 1918. But what is a lesson to be learned? In 1918, quarantine was at least officially imposed. The reality as we see it is that it was not really enforced with any kind of vigor or rigor. The lesson is that if we are imposing quarantine and social distance and isolation now, if we want it to be effective, we need to make sure that it is strictly enforced. We don't want to be in the situation, people in Italy are now saying, well, you know, back in February we had only done this, that or the other, we wouldn't be in the deep plight that we are today. We should act now in South Africa so that in a month's time we don't look back and say, oh, if only early in April we had done this, that and the other. We're in a dire plight as Italy is now.
Professor, it is so startling in a way that all we have in our arsenal, while we have so much medical equipment, it's about staying away from each other. And at the moment, you're probably aware that there's a renewed debate raging around whether all of us should be wearing masks, because there's concern about exactly how this virus moves and travels through the air, whether it's just droplets or whether it's an aerosol. And if we look at those pictures that we've been going through on our screen from 1918 and the Spanish flu, everyone seems to be wearing masks. Do you think there's a lesson in mask wearing there, or is it just impossible to say?
The masks that they used in 1918 were really of not much use, except perhaps psychologically. People might feel with something across their nose and mouth, they're a little bit more protected. In 1918, that was not the case, and certainly one whole dimension of the current debate says it's more a way of protecting someone from you rather than you being protected from someone else. There are masks and there are masks, and some are really not particularly helpful. Others are perhaps a little bit more helpful. It's a debate which is clearly going to have lots of proponents saying, give us at least something that makes us feel a little protected. That's not unimportant, but the reality may be that they're not all that protected and may in fact be false in their belief that they are protected.
Prof. Howard Phillips, looking at the way our government has managed this looming pandemic and hitting us really hard, do you think that they're doing all the right things to control it, or do you think we could have another Spanish flu situation on our hands that, as you say, wiped out some 5 to 6% of our population?
Sally, on paper, the current policies of the South African government appear to be admirable. They are saying the right things, they are announcing the right things, but very often, rather like back in 1918, they may have said we're in quarantine people, but the reality is that those quarantines were very leaky and the medical examinations were very cursory. I think on paper, the policies that are currently being expressed are ones which certainly are up with the best knowledge that there is at the moment. The concern is what happens on the ground. Are these policies actually being implemented strictly and extensively? I said to you a little earlier, we need to make sure, in a sense, that we bite the bullet now so that in 4 weeks' time we don't bite the dust.
Thank you so much for those insights, lessons learned from 100 years ago. Howard Phillips, Emeritus Professor in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town. Thank you so much for your time.